So our first speaker is Julia Pagel from the NEMO network, the network of the European Museum Organizations. Come on, you. It's good to have you here. As you know, NEMO made a large survey on the impact of COVID on the museums, and I think you did also an update, not only once, but twice. And so we hear what Julia has to tell us.
Thank you very much, Christiane. Hello, everybody. Good morning. I'm really, really glad to be here, see all of you in person. It's actually the first time after 1.5 years that I've been talking to real people, and also hi to the people on the screen, but this is really amazing, and thanks for the organizers and the host that they made this hybrid event happen. So, Julia Pagel, I'm the Secretary General from NEMO, Network of European Museum Organizations. And before I start with the presentation, I will tell you a bit about our study and the implications from it. I would just quickly introduce NEMO to you. We are a network very similar to ERIH. Also, when I look at the work plan that you have just presented, of museums, museum umbrella organizations in the different countries in the Council of Europe, within the scope of the Council of Europe. We have individual museums being interested in European cooperation and in training, other museum networks, and very newly we also admit businesses and training and research institutions to our network to really reflect the whole museum ecosystem in Europe. Our activities, we do a lot of advocacy work towards EU institutions mostly. We cooperate and initiate cooperation projects with our members across borders, mostly EU funded. We have a big information platform, exchanges of practices, obviously, that's the core work of every network, I would say. And last but not least, and growingly, we provide a platform for capacity building for European museum professionals. So, but now I'm coming to the survey. I'm actually very happy that Christiane showed some percentages already, because I'm always a bit afraid that showing many graphs will bore people, but this is what surveys are about, so please bear with me in this. We are 1.5 years in the pandemic. I think the only thing that we can say for sure is that whenever we think we know how the situation is going to develop, we are wrong. What we did with this survey was kind of taking stock at where museums were, what the biggest challenges were at that time, and maybe also implications from that. And I think this taking stock also helps us to rethink approaches that we've been having for a long time. We need a basis to start with when we start our discussion, so some data is actually very helpful in this. So our our survey is organized around 3 themes: financial losses, unfortunately, income, and support. Then we have a whole section about digital activities and the development of those, and the whole field of crisis adaptation, which in this case has a lot to do with the pandemic, obviously, but I think we could insert any kind of crisis there, whether it's a climate crisis or it's a social crisis. So it's very much about resilience and agility that's being asked here. What I would like to do in the following is give you an overview of what this the survey is about and the findings from it, and then I would like to go in the implications and the challenges. I was about to say that I hope that what we found out resonates with you, but what I heard from what you are having discussed and what your main challenges is 100% the same for museums, which is also not very, it's probably clear that we are dealing with the same stuff. Yeah, let me start with a visitor with income losses, which is very much related to the visitor drop. When we did our first survey, the first survey started in May 2020, and then we did another survey in January 2021. So within the first survey, with the first lockdown, 89% of the museums, and over 1,000 museums responded to it, were closed. But even after the reopening, visitors didn't come back. Obviously, they did come back, but the drop was crazy. 8 in 10 museums experienced a visitor drop, and 4 in 10 museums experienced a visitor drop by 50 or even 75% after the reopening. When we asked museum what the reason was for the visitor drop, most of them said that it was the drop of tourism that was related to it. But the second most named answer was the interruption of the school year. So they didn't have schools coming in. And another one, which I think is a growing problem now, is a bit of an uneasiness or maybe a lost habit to go to the museum. So people are not coming back because they have a bit lost the normality to go to a museum on the one hand, and on the other hand, there is also a problem of either having to present one of the, in German we call it the 3Gs, you have to be vaccinated, you have to be recovered, or you have to present a negative test, you have to use time slots that are pre-assigned, so you are not that free. So museums are still in the same situation as, or almost in the same situation that they were before. Yeah. Visitors are not coming to the museum. That turns out to be a big income loss. During the crisis, most of the museums declared an income loss. Fortunately, 80% of the museums in Europe are at least co-funded publicly, so hardly any museum had to close down, which is good, at least for now in 2021. But especially museums in touristic areas have told us that they experience income losses of 75 to 80% of their weekly income. And big museums like Stedelijk and the bigger museums are reporting hundreds of thousands of euro income loss per week. So this is something that they need to make up for. And when we ask them about if they can put a number on the field in which they lost most money, then obviously ticket sales was the biggest chunk, but also the discontinuation of programs, which and renting out spaces was the second and third most ticked answer that we've received. Then we asked them about whether they were supported publicly with some emergency funds, and 66% of the museums said they were, either from local, regional, or national level, which is good news. On the other hand, and very similar to what you found out, we heard from many private museums that they had trouble in getting these emergency funds or only receiving parts of it. We asked museums about alternative sources of income, whether they had been able to come up with opening up different sources. And 50% of the museums said they hadn't even tried. And now I think that doesn't reflect that museums don't need the additional sources of funding. I think that reflects that museums don't have the capacity and the resources to actually open up and seek out for new sources of income, which is also reflected in the second graph on the right side, where you can see that larger museums, who normally have more staff and more resources, actually look for more alternative sources of income, while the smaller museums didn't. If you're a one-man band, then you're not doing an additional looking for alternative sources. I'm coming to the digital aspect now, digital section that we looked at. We asked the museums since the onset of the pandemic, so since, when was that, April 2020, March 2020, we asked them whether they had increased their digital activities. And that is one of the good news. 93% of the museums that we had asked had actually increased their online services or they had started a new service. And of those 93%, 75 had increased either online services, like social media, and I think over 50% had increased their video content, which I think is quite a lot, looking at that they are working with a reduced budget. When we look at the demand side, so what did online audiences like most, then what they liked most, at least this is what museums came up with, were social media activities on the one hand, video content on the other hand, and learning material. And I think this is what we need to focus on when we are thinking of developing new digital offers from the museum side or from the sector in general. Looking more at the demand side, because what we've also found out when we asked museums about whether what was successful and what was not successful, that a fourth of the museums, 25%, didn't even track their audience. They didn't track their online audiences. They didn't track whether their activities were successful or not, whether anybody had looked at it. And that's not a good basis to start with when you want to increase the quality of what you're doing. We also had a short question around whether museums had invested into digital resources, and as you can see, it's a bit of a budget that museums added to their digital activities. But what I find more interesting is that hardly any museum hired new staff for that, which to me is kind of clear in a very volatile situation. But 40% of the museums reshifted staff tasks of existing staff to digital activities. So that's good news on the one hand. If you look at the agility of museums, saying we are in an outstanding situation, we are doing something on the spot, but on the other hand, that means that 40% of the museums dedicated staff to activities that they are not trained for at all. And that impacts on the quality. And I think that in the next step also relates to what ICOM and NEMO and all the bigger museum associations have been saying for quite a long time, that we need urgent investment in digital literacy in the museums across all departments. And that's maybe also reflected in this question, whether the museum feel that they need support for their digital transition. I think around 80%, more than 80% say they do. And if you look at in what kind of section of digital transition they need support, most of them say building a digital strategy for a museum. Second, new digital infrastructure. Third, training of staff in digital matters. So we are not talking about help in AR, VR applications. We are talking about the most basic stuff when it comes to digital. And I think this should really ring our bells in terms of really start with some groundwork before we go to the really elaborated stuff. Yeah, coming to the safety during the pandemic or the crisis adaptation, I think what these two graphs show is that both the staff in the museum and the staff looking at the visitors feel that they are safe in the museum. That's good news. I think that does not reflect what the visitors think. We actually had a very quick question around with visitors, and many of them were saying that they had a hard time going to museum and wearing masks. So this is very much a perspective from the museum itself. That has also a lot to do with the fact that museums shifted a lot of their activities to outside offers and outdoor offers, which is possible now, but which is going to be harder in winter. And that a lot of staff actually worked from home during the whole pandemic and are still working from home partly. When we think about the topics that are emerging and that museums really are trying to wrap their head around, then there were two aspects that that were kind of emerging, and I think that reflects very much what you have been talking about. When we look at what will be relevant for your future success. On the one hand, the new metrics, and on the other hand, what are going to be the biggest challenges, then I think it's very clear that both the digital aspect on the one hand, but also bringing visitors back, so the actual people, how can we bring them back to museums or sites in general, was the biggest concern. And that is very much linked to basically everything else that's sitting in this word cloud, if you want to call it like this. And this is maybe what I want to show you from our survey, so no more graphs for you to look at. I would like to go into the learnings from it, and maybe start with 3 observations that we've been having, and then look at possible ways to be a bit more resilient in the future. I had 3 observations. I actually need to have a look at my notes to refer to them correctly. So the learning number 1 is that museums are more innovative than we think. I think we've seen that within a few days after the shutdown, museums came up with an incredible wave of digital offers. Staff was reshifted, so all of that was great. But I think now we have to think about how we can keep up that digital wave, or to make it even broader, an innovative wave, keep it up and sustain it. And that happens by investment in staff, in infrastructure, strategic reviewing, because what we've seen here is innovation at its best, and that can happen through ruptures like the pandemic is. But in order to make that a structural component of an organization, we really need the investment into structures. The second observation is a museum without visitor is lacking its main reason of existence. And I think this is what we've seen in all of our feedback, and this I'm so happy to hear that back from the museums, because we all know that sometimes, especially museums are said to be the organizations that are keeping the heritage, but they really don't like visitors to come in because they could harm the objects. So I think this is not at all the case. I think what we've noticed is that the role of the local community has and will be playing a way bigger role for quite a long time, because the pandemic is not over, which means that the engagement with the community will be more vertical instead of horizontal. I think we'll see less exhibitions, but more ways to engage with it, building on the relationships that make people come back to the museum. And in that context, maybe the digital extension was a good way to connect to visitors during the pandemic when the doors are shut. And there is surely lots of potential, especially in the learning area, I think. But I would argue that before we move to these amazing projects, we really need to make sure that we do this groundwork and invest into understanding what our digital audience, our digital visitors, and also the non-visitors need and what they want. And for this, we need expertise, and that comes out of new museum job profiles and a growing network of experiences and practices. Observation number 3, museums are more than just cultural spaces. They are places of encounter. They provide public spaces in growingly commodified cities and infrastructurally weak regions. I think they have shown during Corona that they actually are a place of health, of learning, of support. And when I told a friend of mine, director of a mid-sized German museum, that I was coming here, she said, you know what, I would have one message for Brussels, because I was referring that I was going through Brussels. I would have one message for policymakers, and that is, they could ask way more from us museums or the sector in general, if they just acknowledged that museums are already contributing to all these agendas of learning, of democracy, of cohesion, and see that we are already there. And I would like to add that this message shouldn't only go out to the policymakers, it actually has to go to the sector itself. because we need to be aware of that we can really make a difference. And sometimes I think we lose that, that gets a bit off our side. Yeah, resilience for the future. Obviously, I don't have the answer for you. That would make this conference very quick. So, but I think what we can say is that the magnifying glass that Corona has been, so all the problems that, or the challenges, as we call them now, that we've been seeing here have been there for a long time. We've discussed organizational transformation, innovation deficits. We have also discussed that we need to keep up with a very quick and fast pace of society changing. So I think what we can do now better than before is that we can use this crisis to really start the conversation, honestly. So what I brought to you is a nice table of ingredients for an agile and open and transformative organization. So on the table, we have autonomy. We need more autonomy on an organizational level. We need an autonomy for our budgets. We need autonomy on an individual level, which unfortunately is also connected to more responsibility that individuals have to carry. We need more innovation focus and proactivity and daring to experiment, which includes also the option to fail, which I think in every other sector is a normal way of developing products and services. But when you look at the public funding logic, there is no way that you could say, you know what, this project didn't work. So I think we just need to be a bit more daring in trying to do something, and then maybe it's not successful. And talking about public funding, I think we need in general more long-term funding. We've seen a lot of money going into digitization projects, and that's a good thing. And I like seeing virtual tours of museums online, but I'd prefer that more museums get structural support. So we have a general increased skills and basic knowledge in the digital areas. We need training of skills and development skills development, and we need informed decision making. I think, and this is not only for the museums, but the sector in general needs to get better at collecting and analyzing data. We need these sound metrics so we can compare better, and also methods to understand our visitors better, especially in the digital world. Because in the digital world, we are really competing with everybody else on the internet. And that's unfortunately also the most user-friendly companies like Amazon or Google. And what else do I have? Yeah, and maybe one of the most important ones is the green operations. If we talk about resilience in the future, then maybe the most important paradigm shift that we have to think about is sustainability at the core of our development. And while we have to make sure that we become green in our own operations, I think we need to understand that the message that we convey to our audiences is something that we also need to own ourselves. It needs to be reflected in our operations, be it the functioning of the museum or the cafe, the diversity of museum staff, or choosing appropriate donors for our museum. And that's the inside operations, and then we also have to, I think, increase our, say, capacity to be advocates for a green and sustainable future, because other than a lot of other organizations, I think we have the capacity to break down those super complex issues of the climate crisis and put them into, how do you say, chewable nibbles of information through exhibitions, through programs, and allow the space for time and reflection. Yeah, and this builds the bridge to maybe 3 concrete recommendations that we have for policymakers. And if you have a look at them, you probably see that all of the 3 points lead to the strengthening and the update of our core activities through informed decision-making, skills development, and appropriate infrastructure, whether that's for communities, whether that's for the digital sphere, or for our sustainability. And with this pledge, I think I'm looking forward to the next discussions. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Julia, for this brilliant presentation. I think this summed up everything wonderful. Are there any questions to Julia at the moment? Here from in the room? Or maybe from the online participants? Not at this moment. Okay. Oh, here is a question. Peter. Yes, you should go to the microphone. Good idea.
Okay, I think you mentioned this in your lecture. We have to make a difference between visitors and tourists. For museums, it's very important to bring back visitors because it's good for their representations to politics, and it's better for their numbers, of course. But for us as ERIH, because we are a touristic network, tourists are more important, and tourists are much more harder to bring back to the museums like visitors. Visitors can come from the region, which is very important. I do not, the people of the region are very, very important for all of us. But only paying tourists are good tourists, and they have to stay in their town, and they have to sleep there, and they have to eat there, and to shop there. And to bring them back with the buses and with the trains and with the aeroplanes, this should be our goal for the future, our first goal for the future, I think.
Yeah. Well, maybe I would say that visitors encompasses both community and tourists at the same time. It's a person coming into whatever kind of site. But I agree with you that it's not in your hands so much, because you are not responsible for bringing back the tourism. While a museum with a community can come up with a cool program and reaching out, I see that there is a difference, and it's actually very interesting to see. We had a look at how traveling in the EU was organized, and 4 out of 10 people choose their destination in Europe based on the cultural offerings. And that means that that a lot of tourism is actually generated from you. So when the tourism is going down, it's also you that is suffering much. Unfortunately, I don't have any good answer to how to bring the tourism back. I just know that if you want to have more visitors than the ones that are just in your backyard, the communities around are the ones that you can influence. But you're very right if it's about the tourism internationally. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much for this point. I think we in Industrial Heritage know that many of the visitors are local and regional visitors, and we do unfortunately not yet attract so many international travelers, but I think all visitors should be welcome after the pandemic crisis. Thank you very much, Julia. Good to have you here with us, and thank you for the input. Thank you. So, our next speaker is Mike Neville, who is one of our online speakers. Mike Neville is the ERIH representative for England, and Mike tells us something about restarting industrial tourism in England, the impact of COVID-19. Hello, Mike. The floor is yours.
Good morning. It's great to be able to talk to you. I only wish I could be there in person to have a look at the fabulous textile heritage you've got there. So I'm just going to share my screen and then move on. So hopefully that's my screen shared. Can you see that?
Ausmachen, solange die Leinwand ist, oder geht das nicht? Der hat nicht einen Schalter, oder?
Great. Right. So I'm going to talk about the impact of COVID on English industrial heritage sites. Going to pick up actually on a lot of the themes we've already heard this morning, but just to put some context around that, obviously we as the New England ERIH rep, we have a number of roots in England, and we're hopeful of expanding that over the next few years, which is positive, possibly in Yorkshire. That's something to look forward to in the future. What one of the things about the UK and England in particular, but it applies to the UK, is the way in which industrial heritage is presented is quite distinctive. We have a very large voluntary sector that delivers and opens up industrial heritage and have done for 40 or 50 years, and I'll pick up on that a bit later. We also have a large professional archaeology sector that is involved in day-to-day industrial archaeology and industrial heritage activity, which is largely, but not exclusively, focused on developer funding, redevelopment, but there's also a large element of community archaeology in there. That continued throughout lockdown because construction activity continued. And of course, we have a large number of preserved industrial heritage sites open to the public in the UK, and in England in particular. We have around 606 preserved sites open to the public in the period 1998 to just before the pandemic. And those sites are quite varied, but you can see here on this graph, it's yet another graph, that the largest number of sites by type are watermills, windmills, transport and metal sites, but there are also a huge variety of other types of industries represented amongst those preserved industrial heritage sites, as you would expect from a British context. And those sites are run, or historically have been run in the last 20, 30 years by a variety of different organisations. We nearly half are run by charities and trusts. We have 18% run by local authorities, although that is a declining number over the last 20 years. And we have 15% of those sites run entirely on a voluntary or private basis, and only 9% of the 606 sites I'm looking at this morning are actually accredited museums. Now, if I want next to turn to some direct impacts for COVID-19, and once more there'll be some familiar themes here that we've already touched upon this morning. The UK had, well, the UK and England in particular had 3 periods of lockdown. March to July 2020, November to December 2020, and then from January to April 2021. All sites closed, of course, no access possible for the public, although volunteers and particularly professional staff did still access those sites for maintenance purposes. We had heritage guidance issued in England in June 2020 from Historic England about the impact of COVID on the maintenance of museums, and also the impact on displays and the physical fabric of those buildings when trying to open up the site in a COVID-safe way. And in 2020, no more than 50% of those 606 industrial heritage sites were open in the summer and into the autumn after the November lockdown. And less than 25% of those sites then reopened in December after the second lockdown. So the sector, as we've seen across Europe, has been was severely hit in 2020. And just a graphic just to show the number of sites, the percentage of sites opened in between the 3 lockdowns. We had a very slow reopening in April, May 2021 in England as the regulations were gradually lifted. What that has meant on the ground is that sites, industrial heritage sites, have had to cope with closing, reopening, closing, reopening, closing, reopening. So a site such as the Crofton Beam Engine on the Kennet and Avon Canal on the left there chose to open, chose not to open in December after the second lockdown, and didn't reopen until May, although they were open during last summer. However, they did have, during the lockdown in October and at the beginning of this year, they did have staff on site and volunteers on site trying to maintain the building and make sure it was safe for the summer reopening. And on the right-hand side there, Heritage Railways, Spa Valley Railway, for instance, were very quick to reopen after each lockdown, but also they were very keen and actually needed to maintain their railway stock during lockdown, so that they adapted with COVID-safe protocols in order to allow them to do that. One of the downsides of lockdown has been an increase in vandalism. Historically in England, there has been a low level of vandalism, either spray painting on walls, or in the mid-2010s, there was targeted vandalism, stripping out copper wiring, for instance, when commodity prices went through the roof. We've seen an uptick in vandalism on sites, particularly preserved heritage railways, where people were accessing the railway line to walk along it. Vandalism at other sites around information boards, and particularly distressing was the Avon-Croft Open Air Museum in the Midlands, where the windows on all the buildings were smashed on the very weekend it reopened. Although that is exceptional, but nevertheless, there's this rise in vandalism during the lockdown. So 50% of those 606 industrial heritage sites did not open in 2020. Visitor numbers were down at least 70% across those sites that did reopen. And we've recorded amongst the industrial heritage sector in England around 470 redundancies in 2020. And there is a worry that there might be more later on, picking up on that theme of resilience that we've already touched upon this morning. In terms of financial support has come from a number of sources. The Heritage Railways raised money directly from the public through crowdsourcing and in 2020. And between April 2020 and April 2021, they raised over £3.6 million just in England alone. But there were also similar crowdfunding calls for funds in Wales and Scotland as well. We had a national round of funding from the various governments in the UK and in England. We had the Cultural Recovery Fund, launched in the summer of 2020. Historic England was responsible for distributing £50 million of that funding in England, but there were also funds from Arts Council England and the National Heritage Lottery Fund as well. There's been 3 rounds of that national grant funding. So £34 million was distributed to 131 industrial heritage sites in October 2020. And then in the second round, in April 2021, we had over 130 sites received a further £21 million. And there's currently a third round of funding opened in September in England and due to close in October 2021. I should say that there were thousands of cultural heritage organisations supported by that Cultural Recovery Fund, but this does represent, at a national level anyway, a significant support for the industrial heritage sector. And you can see here the breakdown by region and types of cultural organisation of the overall Cultural Heritage Fund in the first round in October 2020. So industrial heritage sites probably form about 10% of the organisations supported by this national funding. There were also local funds from local authorities and from local trusts as well, although it's harder to track the precise figures of support given to industrial heritage sites over the last 12 months, although we are doing that through the Industrial Heritage Network that I'll talk about next. So as well as being the ERIH representative for England, I'm also the Industrial Heritage Support Officer for England. That's a post funded by Historic England, based at the Iron Gorge Museum Trust, set up in 2012. And that project is about supporting sustainability and conservation standards in those 606 preserved industrial heritage sites open to the public, helping with capacity and improving operating practices, but also trying to help these sites sustain that legacy. And as part of this network, we have 10 industrial heritage networks across England. They were set up in 2017-18 with the support of the Canal and Rivers Trust, with the Association for Industrial Archaeology, Association for Independent Museums, and the English Heritage Trust as well. Originally, they met in person at each site, but with the advent of COVID, we took them online. The idea is that the individual host could pick a theme and then we bring everybody together and discuss that. Going online allowed more people to actually participate in the meetings at a cheaper cost, which is why we'll be keeping those meetings as the pandemic eases, but we will hope to reintroduce some in-person events later on in the year. And with this particular project, we beefed up the online offering. We've already heard about that this morning. So we improved the 2 websites that the project runs, particularly recording the latest guidance and grant news and initiatives for the industrial heritage sites that the project is dealing with, and also picking up on story and member news, because as we've heard, the sites need to be maintained during the lockdowns, and members and professional staff were coming on site. And we also had a Facebook and Twitter presence as well. And one of the things we did was to highlight guidance and grants. So this, for instance, is part of the guidance from Historic England about how to adapt your site for reopening in a COVID-safe way. And as you can see, it deals with volunteers as well as the physical aspect of dealing with COVID in a heritage building. Just to finish off then, I use those Industrial Heritage Network meetings to actually survey a cross-section of those 606 sites, which are run by about 400 organisations, between October 2020 and October 2021. So we got roughly 100 individuals representing about 72 sites. So that's about 11% of those preserved industrial heritage sites in England, which are open to the public. And we were asking specifically about the impact of COVID and how they adapted. We had some interesting individual comments, some of which you can see here. Comments about how the catering and shop facilities had to change, how many sites were unable to access their buildings and collections, and that led to maintenance problems such as blocked drains or roofs leaking, or indeed boilers going out of certification. There was pressure from volunteers to return to help on the site, but those had to be limited for COVID safety reasons. Also, lots of sites where they had the space adapted by using the open air grounds around their industrial heritage sites as a way of bringing the public back in and also keeping their volunteers on site. And that persistent problem of training younger volunteers has been made more acute, worse by COVID, particularly with some volunteers in the older age bracket being cautious to return. So just to summarise, you can see industrial heritage sites in England as across Europe adapting to not only COVID, but the post-COVID environment as well. There were business and tourist opportunities, such as traditional flour milling sites increasing their output in the first lockdown because of supply difficulties elsewhere in the commercial flower world. Outdoor venues the outdoor grounds being used increasingly by industrial heritage sites. But also we noticed that there was a diversity of business models. So food offerings became very important during lockdown for the sites that could offer that. They quite often it would only be the cafe that was open on the site during lockdown, and then that became a sort of a social hub almost for local communities. And we have seen, and we talked. We've already talked briefly this morning about digital offerings. We saw an increase in digital offerings amongst the 400 organisations running these 600 sites, but it's actually in an English context from a very low base. So about 10% of the sites I was able to look at were increasing their digital offering, which is quite low, and that's a worry for the future. Obviously, there's a lot more skilling that needs to be done. However, 3/4 of the sites we talked to in the Industrial Heritage Network meetings, so that's about 50 sites, did say they were looking to improve their online offering, either to the public or as a way of supporting staff and volunteers. So there are some definite positives to take from the way in which industrial heritage sites in England have coped with the pandemic, but there are lingering worries about the number of volunteers who will be available, and also the financial viability of these industrial heritage sites once the grants have run out, which they will do, of course, early next year. And then we'll know a bit more when the next seasonal opening of industrial heritage sites starts in April, May next year. We'll know more about the financial impact of COVID in the long term. There we go. Thank you. And I hope that was okay. Right, I shall stop sharing.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much, Mike, for the insight you gave us for the situation in the UK. I think that covers everything that we heard in the morning before, especially Julia's thesis that museums are more flexible than we anticipated them to be, and they adapted very well to the crisis, or at least tried to adapt. But I think you're right that we need to see in the long term what the impact is. Are there any questions to Mike at that moment from the floor here or from the online participants? Katharina, ich sehe die Online-Participants hier auf dem Screen. Ah, jetzt, okay. No, I don't see the chat. I see the chat here. Yeah, I think there's a question raised how museums deal with the rising energy costs, the current rising energy costs. I mean, this is also a challenge, I think, that we discuss here, that climate change and the rising energy costs and heating are a big challenge for industrial heritage sites. I'm not sure, Mike, if you have an answer for this.
I don't. I know there are particular problems around the supply of coal, for instance, as a heritage fuel, which is causing issues for heritage railways, and also sites running stationary steam engines run on coal, of which we have about 30 in England. But there will be long-term issues with the cost of energy rising. I know 1 or 2 museums in England have installed renewable energy, particularly solar panels. But it's just an extra cost at a time when incomes are down. I don't have any solutions, but it's definitely an issue.
Yeah, I think we touched this briefly last year when we had the colleague from FedEx Rail here already, that this is probably a big issue that comes to the industrial heritage museums or is already there. Okay, so no further questions here from the floor and no further questions in the chat as far as I can see. Thank you very much, Mike. Good to have you with us, at least online, and hope to see you next year.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Peter, a short question?
Short question to Michael. Michael, you mentioned this digital offers in the museums,
Yes.
which are at the moment are free. Are you the opinion that they should be also free in the future, or should we take fees for it or something like this? We discussed this also in the last session at Berlin, but we didn't come to a result because it's not so easy to answer it. What's your opinion?
I think we need a mixed approach. I think there are some offers that should be free because it brings members of the public in and makes them feel connected with the museum. But I also feel that there are extra services that online that museums could offer that they could charge for. And I know that some of the industrial museums in England have provided special events which they've charged for, not massively, but they have charged for, and that's a potential extra second income stream. But I think museums have to offer free material as well to bring people in.
Okay, thank you very much, Michael, for this for this opinion on it. I think it's not an easy answer to it. Okay, thank you very much, Michael. Then we would move on to our next speaker. Our next speaker is also an online speaker, Maria Teixeira. I'm not spelling these names very properly, I think, from the Portuguese National Railway Museum. And visitors far away, but never so close, new times, new audiences, new strategies. Maria, good to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Hello, Ghent. Hello, Ghent. Hello, everyone online. So I will speak a little bit about our experience in dealing with the pandemic and the post-pandemic times. Are you seeing my screen? Hello?
So we see your screen.
Yes. Are you seeing my slides?
Yes.
Okay. So sorry for this. I was talking about that National Railway Museum is open to public in 2015, and it is the only National Railway Museum in the center, in the Médio Tejo, or the Tagus Valley region. So we are serving in terms of local community who are serving 2,047 inhabitants. We'll share you a short video for you to see a little bit of our museum. Can you share the video, please?
One moment.
Okay, thank you so much.
Video's coming.
Thank you so much for that. I need to share my screen again. Okay, so you had a little peek of, in our museum. So it tells the story of Portuguese national railways in Portugal, 160 years of history. And we have one of the best collections in Europe, things like the first train ticket. I can pass my, can you give me order to use my presentation?
You have the control over your presentation.
No, I don't have it. I'm sorry. I will try again. I'm sorry, but it is not working.
So we can we can't manage your presentation on your computer, but we could start your presentation here from our backup. And you have to say
sorry
next
for
slide,
this.
please. So,
Okay.
No worry, wait a minute.
I don't know why this is not working.
Wait a minute. Presentation is coming.
Okay, let's start now. So you are seeing one of the smallest pieces of our museum. It's the first train ticket from the first journey to railway journey in Portugal. Next slide, please. We have multi-town steam locomotives. Next slide, please. And our treasure, the Portuguese national, the Portuguese Royal train. Next slide, please. And another treasure, the presidential train. So our museum shows the more than 160 years of history in Portugal. And we talk about the machines, about engineering, about industry, and of course, about the people that, and the stories of the people that made the railways in Portugal. Next slide, please. So we were very happy with the results of our museum. We opened in 2015 and till 2019, we were increasing the number of our visitors. So we are very enthusiastic with our work. And then, next slide, please. Then 2020 comes and the pandemic comes. And we had a decrease in the number of our visitors, more than 60%. This is in line with the decrease in the national museums in Portugal. It's something like around 55, and we are with 60, more than 60%. This had a strong impact in the National Railway Museum and a strong impact in the team. We are lost and trying to figure out what to do about this. Next slide, please. Okay, so here in Portugal, the first general lockdown happens between 13th of March and 18th of May. The museum was locked, but we managed to keep the entire team working, as most of our funding is public. So we had some constraints about financial resources, but we keep to run our team, our entire team. So those work in the conservation, restoration service stays at the museum, the other ones in teleworking, but we defined a strategy to keep all the team working and preparing the next times. Next slide, please. So here you can see a colleague of mine cleaning and preserving and restoring the collection. One of the the tasks that we did during this first lockdown. Next slide. We had a project to have a new online inventory database. So we started this project during the first lockdown. This will be online in the end of this month or next month. Next slide, please. And here, it was the moment that we start to think that we need to work more in digital content, and we did it. We did some digital content like videos for social networks, but mainly we dedicated ourselves to build a new website with different languages accessible to blind people, etc. So here we start to realize that we need to be stronger on the digital world. Next slide, please. We also realized that we already had a project on accessibility, but at this point that the museum was closed, we think a little bit about this, and we decided that we need to get our accessibility better, not in physical, or not only physical accessibility, but also on digital accessibility. Next slide, please. The next slide. Okay, here is. No, the other one. So, during the first lockdown, we worked in a contingency plan to prepare the reopening of the museum. This plan follows the rules of the health national authorities and of the government and municipal authorities. This took us a lot of time, a lot of energy, a lot of effort, because it was everything new. Really, none of us knows how to deal with this coronavirus and with this pandemic. So to build this plan where we think in everything that could happen when the museum reopened, to get our people, our staff safe, but mainly to get our future visitors safe. The next slide, please. So this plan had lots of aspects. I will only share some of them. So we delimited one side circuits for visitors. We see an example here. This is an open space, and at that time it was not an open space. Next. We keep the distance between staff and visitors, when in our museum, since the beginning, we are working in the opposite way. We want to have the visitors next to the staff, and now we are working on the opposite, and it was a strong war to get this. Next slide, please. For each space of the museum, and we have a museum with almost 5 hectares, lots of buildings, lots of exterior spaces, but for each of one of the spaces, we determined the limited number per visitors in each space. Next. So this is not new for you. The hygiene of the museum was, and the clinic was reinforced. This took us surplus financial effort, so we need to put more money to get all the museum clean and safe for everybody. The mandatory use of masks, not new, and we limited the number of persons by visitors group. Next, please. This was dramatic for us. We are used to work with large groups of people, 50, 60, and then we are working with the maximum groups of 10 persons. It was a shock at this time for us, but it was the way we find it to keep the museum running. Next, please. So when we reopened in May 2020, we were already trying to have a digital approach and a digital strategy. And at this time, we did our first totally digital event. It was the 60th anniversary of the museum. And we have musical concerts tailored to us. And we have people talking about the museum and things like that it's like a tentative, one of the first ones to get more in the digital world and don't lost relevance of the museum. Next first. Well, when you reopened, all operation was conditioned to the health authorities' requirement, conditions by the municipal authorities' requirements. And the big challenge was to keep the museum running and to provide a good experience to the visitors. This is a very, very huge challenge for us, but we continue to work since the end of 2000. Next slide, please. So we were enthusiastic because the museum was open, but then in January, we had the second general lockdown. So we were working in this lockdown during to April that year. So when we opened the museum opened, but it was closed on the weekends. And we working on a general contingency plan, 9 updates. This is a lot of effort for the team. We need to talk with medical people, with the people that advise us how to adapt the museum to the health authorities' requirements. We had, as I said, 9 updates. Now today, I'm glad to share that we are now working to draw up the contingency plan. As here in Portugal, we are with more than 85% of vaccinated people. So we are okay. So we are thinking in move back the contingency plan in the measure of its aspects. And for each activity that we are developing in the museum, we made a contingency plan. Next slide, please. So during our second lockdown in 2021, it was a time that we think, no, we need to get more digital. So we invest a lot in created digital contents like videos. This content was displayed in social networks like YouTube, Instagram, and Facebook. Well, our museum, it's a big museum in scale, but our team is very small and our financial resources are not so many as we wish. So all of this was done by the team. We had online training, we bought computer equipment, we draw the tests, we made the editing of the videos, we did everything. The way that we did it was to get the spirit of the mission in the team, and we were worried because without people in the museum, we are worried that people will forget our museum will lack relevance. So we did a lot of efforts, everyone, but when I say everyone in the team contributes to this making of digital content, it's true. Everyone participated because it was the only way to get this. Next slide, please. So in this digital content that we are preparing, we use our creativity. Was seeing lots of museums and sites that they have virtual tours, professional virtual tours, some of them guided virtual tours. Or, well, it was not our case. So we decided to provide virtual tours using Zoom and Teams software. What we did, we put together videos of the museum, we put together, because we don't have a mobile camera, so we put together videos and some photos, and we managed to have a kind of virtual tours. Well, next slide, please. So we publicize these virtual tours in Facebook and Instagram, of course, in our website. We did a huge mailing list by email to schools, prisons, nurseries, elderlies, medical facilities, every place that we thought that would be people that cannot come out because we are in a lockdown. So we are very enthusiastic with this. The results are more than 2,000 people, 2,000 people was reached by our virtual tours. The thing that make us happy is that we never thought about one thing. These virtual tours was for people that cannot come to the museum because the museum was closed. But what happens is that we made virtual tours for people that never went to the museum and they will not get there anyway. And that is because they are, for example, prolonged illness situations, they are with very high mobility difficulties, they live very far, so they are in prison. Yes, young people that are in prison. So we thought that it was a surprise, because we start to think that visitors are not only the people that come to the museum. So we need to have a thought on this. Next, please. So as I was saying, this brings us a new audience, and we are still not prepared for this new audience. The people that are not coming physically to the museum, but they want to visit the museum. Next, please. So this was a big lesson for us. We need to invest more in virtual and digital contents. So we are now working on a new project to have a professional virtual tour with guided virtual tours. So this is possible because it will be supported from the national funding from the Ministry of Culture. Next slide, please. So since April 2001, and with all our contingency plans, I didn't tell, but our contingency plan moves and being updated, not only just because of the national health authorities guidelines are always changing, but we are learning with the pandemic. And as since we are learning with the pandemic, we will finding ways of having the museum running. So we are on full service since April 2001. Next, please. So we did exhibitions. Next. Next, please. We did theaters plays, lots of them. Please, the other one. We have several talks in the museum about different thematics. The next one. We even have a fest, a 3 days fest that we call it Rail Fest, and this was done under the European Year for Rail Transport. We have here in the museum thousands of people, and of course, this Rail Fest had contingency plan. Next, please. So, as I said, the big challenge for us is to find a balance between the experience of the visitors and the contingency of the pandemic, and also the requirements of health authorities. So for their confidence, we apply for national clean and safe seal that says that our museum is clean and is safe for people. And we also get the European Tourist COVID-19 Safety Seal. This is for the confidence for people that visit us. The next one. So with a great surprise, and we think, the team think that these results are because of our work during the pandemic, during the lockdown, trying to reach people in a digital way, and also the improvements that we are doing and while advertising, that people come back to the museum. So this summer we are with better results than 2019, a little bit more than 25% than 2009, because we are now comparing, of course, our results with 2009 and not 2020. The next one, please. So with these almost 2 years of pandemic and all the constraints that we felt in our museum and the efforts that we need to do, what we learned one thing that we never thought about before: the museum may close again. Well, we don't know if it will be for the COVID-19 or because another situation, but we need to get present. It's our thoughts that our museum may close again, other museums may close again. Other lesson for us is that our audience is not just the people who visit us. Before the pandemic, our work on digital contents and social networks, website, and so on, it was planned and thinking to get people to go to the museum. Now we realize that we need to have a digital strategy that needs to have these two main objectives. Of course, getting people to the museum, but serve people that cannot go to the museum. When we had our virtual tours, they were planned for 30 minutes. We did virtual tours of 2 hours because people really are interested in the heritage, they are interested in the museum, they are interested in collection, they are interested in the railway system, but they can't come there because of their physical conditions or other conditions, like people in prisons, for instance. So we need to scratch this digital strategy in these 2 plans. The other big and very, very important lesson that we learned is about accessibility. Well, we did a lot, all the museums all around the world. In the second lockdown, mainly, we did lots of digital contents, and we published it on the web, and we are very happy. But then we start receiving emails from people saying that we are doing that, but we can use that. And I'm talking about blind people and deaf people. So we are working on digital content, we are putting the digital content online, but we are forgetting of hundreds of people that can use the museum's content. So we are now putting our efforts to develop this digital strategy together with the accessibility. And our our recent works like videos, we are already doing that. And then a lesson, we already knew that, but I should reinforce these. Teams can make a difference. So, and to have that, we need to build in the museum a sense of mission. We can lose our museum, we can lose our jobs, we need to do something and put everyone together to work for the same strategy and the same objective. Many thanks. And sorry for this presentation preoccupation.
Thank you very much, Maria, for this brilliant presentation. I think it's also good to see that it's not only that you're not only working on digital offers, also on site, a lot of work to do. I'm sure you all know this and you all had the same experience as Maria. There was no blueprint for the situation. Everybody had to work on a pure basis of day-to-day basis and unexpected development. So thank you very much. Are there any questions at the moment to Maria? A short one, Peter. We are running out of time.
Maria, my congratulations for the big job you do and your team. It's absolutely best practice in Europe. I'm sure about it. Congratulations.
Okay, do we have any questions in the chat, Katharina? No. Okay, so then I would take the opportunity to invite you to a coffee break, 20 minutes coffee break.